Start with introduction. First of all, I want to thank the previous speaker because he just gave me the best setup for Covenants, because everything you can do with mini-scripts gets so much better with Covenants. And we'll get into all of that, from inheritance to recovery to whatever you want to do. So I love the setup. I also love that he talked about script, because there's going to be a couple of script examples in my talk. So yeah, perfect setup. And much like the previous talk, mine is going to get a little technical. I have tried to make it plain English, but I probably failed a few times. So we'll get to questions and hopefully be able to clear up the places where I don't speak in plain English. Yeah, like Eric said there, I'm a Bitcoin wallet developer. So I come at this, I think a lot of folks that talk at these conferences are kind of protocol developers. They work in the open source primarily. I work primarily in the closed source corporate Bitcoin world. So I've been actually delivering products at scale to Bitcoin users, and I think it gives me somewhat of a context from which to talk about what we want to do with Bitcoin and how we can make it better for people in the future. So, a little intro, and I think my slides are ready. All right, let's do this. So, yeah, the topic here is does Bitcoin need covenants? We talk about Bitcoin as the ultimate system. It's unchangeable. We can't change the 21 million limit. Bitcoin is this perfect thing that was released by Satoshi 14 years ago. And so the question is, does it need to change? Does it need covenants? Is there more we could do with Bitcoin? Does it need something more to meet its potential, to be the money for the world that I think all of us that are here think Bitcoin can be the money for the world and change the world through being better money? So let's try to figure out that question. I already talked about most of this. Yeah, I've been in Bitcoin for a long time, professionally for about 5 years, and I'm a Music 2 fanboy, is the last thing I kind of hadn't mentioned. Also, DALL-E 2 made that for me, and I thought it was funny. All right, so here's what we're going to talk about. First, we're going to talk about just what are covenants, because I think it's actually a very hard question to answer, and we can't even talk about whether Bitcoin needs covenants if we don't know what they are. So we'll start there, then we'll get into whether we need them, and then from there we'll get into what covenants can do for us and what ideas are out there for how to bring that into Bitcoin. We'll finish up with my personal opinions and some questions. Time, hopefully. All right, so what is a covenant? I've got a few definitions here. First, from dictionary.com, a formal, solemn, binding agreement. Well, that's a little bit of helpful context, but that would apply to many things that we do in Bitcoin, not just what we're talking about here. So I don't know if it's that helpful. From Investopedia, it can promote with a positive covenant or disallow with a negative covenant. Okay, well that's more interesting. We might want to restrict how our Bitcoin is used or say it must be used in some certain way. That might be interesting. All right. Here's my definition of covenants. And I was working on this until today. So I'm not going to say it's the perfect or the right definition, but I think it's helpful. So covenants restrict the context in which Bitcoin can be spent by reference to data outside of its own locking scripts, which is its address, and unlocking scripts, which are like the signatures you post to release it. And this is in contrast with those signatures that I just mentioned, where those just say who can spend some Bitcoin. They don't talk about the context in which it can be spent. So that's what I think a covenant is it looks outside of the actual who and the signatures into some other data in terms of deciding whether the Bitcoin can be spent or not. So, does Bitcoin need covenants? And don't worry, these slides are linked to the presentation. They're all there. All right, Bitcoin already has covenants based on the definition I just gave. So there's been all this debate. Do we need covenants in Bitcoin? I think the best way to answer that is that we have them. We have opt-check sequence verify and opt-check lock time verify. And we just said that covenants are a way to restrict the spending of Bitcoin to the context in which it can be spent. And so using mini-script or just a raw script, you can make an address that restricts when your Bitcoin can be spent. And the way that works using these two opcodes is that the script interpreter looks at the sequence from the input or the lock time in the transaction to decide whether to allow this spending of Bitcoin. So the script looks at some context outside of the locking and unlocking scripts. So these are covenants. These are time covenants. And these covenants enabled the Lightning Network and other improvements for Bitcoin users, such as exactly the miniscript stuff that he was just talking about. So Bitcoin has covenants. They're already helping Bitcoin be more usable by more people, both in terms of keeping their Bitcoin safe and in more people using it through Lightning Network. Okay, fine. So we have covenants. Do we need more covenants? Well, I would say covenants in general scale Bitcoin. We've already seen that with the covenants that enabled the Lightning Network, but I think we can do more. And there's two ways in which covenants scale Bitcoin. The first is that covenants enable holders to protect their Bitcoin from theft or loss. Again, the setup here is perfect for the previous presentation. He talked about moving from low recoverability solutions to high recoverability solutions. And Miniscript helps with that, because with Miniscript, you can, with more confidence, make a script that protects your Bitcoin in exactly the way that you want it to. Well, covenants add a whole nother potential layer to that, because you can add restrictions on the sequence of transactions that must be made to spend some Bitcoin, or you can add restrictions on the exact transaction. You can even do whitelisting with covenants, although I think that's a terrible idea, but it's a possibility you could do. So covenants allow users to more safely hold their Bitcoin, which is a form of scaling. Right now, people use custodial solutions because they're afraid of losing their keys. If we can make, through covenants or through Miniscript or both, it's safer to hold your Bitcoin, then more people will hold it. And the more people hold their own Bitcoin, the greater the possibility that Bitcoin realizes its potential of letting people be their own banks. People use custodians and banks because they don't want to lose their funds. But with Bitcoin, with Miniscript, with covenants, we can make it so that it's safe for everybody to be their own banks. And that's, I think, again, what I'm here for at least. So I hope everyone's here for that. The second way in which covenants scale Bitcoin is that they enable the sharing of UTXOs and the sharing of on-chain transactions. Lightning Network is a kind of a microcosm of this, where two parties share a single UTXO, and they can shift funds back and forth within that UTXO, and then Lightning layers on top of that a routing system so that many people can chain that shifting of balance across UTXOs. With more covenants, we can do more UTXO sharing. People have talked about channel factories, or there's Barak presented about the ARC protocol. Those are examples of ways to share UTXOs more. And if you can safely share UTXOs more, then you're also sharing on-chain transactions. In the Lightning Network, you share on-chain transactions across many individual shifts of funds. So you might spend 100 HTLCs before you settle a channel, or more, hopefully. So that's one way of scaling your on-chain transactions using covenants. And there's more that we'll talk about later. So didn't Lightning already scale Bitcoin for everyone? Well, it does, thanks to covenants, but only to about 100 million users with one channel each. Lightning still requires people to be able to make on-chain transactions to hold UTXOs. And what Lightning didn't really do is scale the number of individual people that could possibly make a transaction on-chain each year. So there's a limitation there. So if Bitcoin is going to serve the world's financial needs, it does need more covenants. Bitcoin needs more covenants. Now, many people have said in various ways that covenants are scary. And that's why I started with the definition of covenants, because I think that when we hear covenants, we often hear kind of a restriction on our actions. And that's the way, like, if you're in a homeowners association, perhaps, is the best example of a covenant people have negative feelings about. There's a land covenant attached to your home that forces you to deal with this homeowners association. And that is not a good feeling. And so are covenants scary like that? Well, let's talk about it. How does a covenant get applied to Bitcoin? Well, let's start with how normal Bitcoin works without covenants. Again, just like the previous talk showed, we have a script associated with every Bitcoin address, and you, the recipient of some Bitcoin, has to create that script. Most addresses people create use a script something like this. Side note, there are a couple of address types that don't use scripts, technically, but approximately, even those are approximately a script like this. A public key and a check signature operation. So that's locking the Bitcoin to who can spend it. Whoever holds the private key corresponding to that public key can spend it. If you want to add a lock time covenant, a time lock covenant, you might use a script that looks like this. It's got a public key and a check sig operation, and then a time and a lock time check. So you've added a covenant. And because you have to give that new address to whoever's going to send you Bitcoin, the only person that can apply a covenant to your address is you. Only you. There's no way for a third party to apply a covenant to your Bitcoin. That's never been a concept that's been thought about in Bitcoin. I don't think it ever will be. It'd be very strange if it was, unless you're Craig Wright on BSV. Here in the real world, no one but you can apply a covenant to your Bitcoin. Okay. What are covenants good for then? We've talked about some kind of hand-wavy examples here. Let's get into some more specific features. I think I've mentioned some of these already. One, and kind of the most basic covenant that's kind of being talked about, is the ability to specify the exact next way some Bitcoin can be spent. People talk about you doing inheritance with Bitcoin, planning for your inheritance. You could combine a time lock and an exact next transaction in your Bitcoin scripts and have a restriction that says, if this Bitcoin is not spent by the year 2045, then the exact next transaction is to move it into these 3 addresses for my 3 kids. So that's one thing you can do with covenants. You could require a series of transactions. You can have a covenant that says you must make this transaction and then that transaction to spend this Bitcoin, where there's a delay in between perhaps. This is a concept called reactive security can be done doing this with this other feature, letting Bitcoin be recovered to a safe location. With Miniscript, you can have recovery keys where if you lose your keys, someone can help you recover that by being the backup key. But what if someone steals your keys? Miniscript doesn't really help you there because someone got the key, they spent the Bitcoin, and you can't do anything. With a covenant, you can also have reactive security. Someone steals your keys, they try to spend your Bitcoin, but because you chose to apply a sequence of transactions covenant with a recovery path covenant to your Bitcoin, you can, well, they try to steal it, you move it off to a safe place before they can get it because of the series of transactions it has to go through. You could potentially limit how much is spent in a specific transaction. You can whitelist addresses. Again, that's a bad idea in my opinion. We'll have more of my opinions later. You can also control how Bitcoin is combined together. You might make a covenant that says, this Bitcoin can only be spent if it also includes Bitcoin being sent from that other address. I don't know exactly what the use case for that might be. I was thinking of ideas of just things you can do with covenants. That's one I came up with. And there's much, much more. These are kind of the base level features. Because we have brilliant Bitcoin developers out there, like SuperTestNet and many others, who go crazy with creative ideas, and Ark, Barak of Ark. You can build on these building blocks of ways to protect Bitcoin, to share UTXOs, to build great protocols on Bitcoin. Now let's get specific. And the first thing I want to cover in specifics is what types of covenant are there? Because we've defined covenants kind of from the outside of what is it in general, but what does that mean in Bitcoin? So this is where we get a bit technical, and I'll try to keep it as human as possible. So the first kind is a transaction hash covenant. Now, hashing, this is when you take some set of data and you apply a function that compresses it down irreversibly into a smaller amount of data, and that's how we do transaction IDs in Bitcoin. That's how we do signature verifications in Bitcoin. So a transaction hash covenant is similar to a signature check, except that instead of a signature being checked to know whether the hash is the right hash or not, it's just checking the equality of the hash of the transaction to some other hash. And so you can hash whatever part you want, check that hash, and see, and that's a way to apply a covenant. This is how you apply that exact next transaction idea. So I want to say, I lock this Bitcoin at an address that has a transaction hash covenant on it, and that hash is the exact next transaction that can spend this Bitcoin. Then there's a transaction introspection covenant. This is where instead of looking at the hashed data, some part of the transaction hashed compressed into an apparently random string, we look at the actual contents of the transaction. And this could be the next address it's going to go to in the form of scripts. This could be the amounts being spent. This is where we could do, maybe this address can only create outputs no larger than 1 million Satoshis when it's spent. You can look at the amounts being spent or created in the transaction and apply a covenant with introspection. The next two actually are specific types of introspection. Introspection is a huge spectrum of things you can do with Bitcoin covenants. So the first kind of special case here is a script transformation. This is how you get to a series of transactions where each transaction takes the existing script and modifies it for the next one. You could do, for example, op countdown would be a covenant where you put like 5 op countdown, and all that requires is that the next transaction is the same script as the existing transaction, or the next output rather is the same script as the existing output, but with 4 op countdown. That'd be a script transformation covenant. It's a form of introspection, but is a one that is worth talking about separately. And lastly, a deferred covenant. So far we've talked about mostly scripts that look at things happening within a single input at a time. When you spend Bitcoin, you may or may not know, you spend it like cash. You take several bills out of your Bitcoin wallet, you hand them to a vendor, they give you back change. That's the way to think about Bitcoin. So a deferred covenant lets you look at the total transaction in context. So this would be something like limit the amount that can be spent from this address in a single transaction. So you take the sum of all the inputs and the sum of all the outputs, you subtract them, and you see whether that's valid or not. And so what's special about this, and the reason it's a deferred special type of covenant, is that the script validation for each input can't actually succeed or fail until the end of the transaction verification. Whereas in existing Bitcoin scripts, you always know whether the input is valid at the end of that input's validation. So deferred covenant lets you look at the broader context and do work kind of after the whole transaction has been verified. More specific. Let's talk about some of the specific covenant proposals that people have actually been talking about in the Bitcoin developer space. I'm guessing, let's get a show of hands here. Who has heard of opctv? Great. Who's heard of sighash anyprev out, or APO? All right, we're about the same half-ish people heard of these things. So yeah, those are the two most commonly talked about ways that we could end up with covenants in Bitcoin. So check template verify, CTV. I put a little blue up there of what kind of covenant this is, just to kind of reference back to what we're doing here. Check template verify is a new opcode, similar to adding op check lock time verify. It's about the same amount of code as doing that. Talked about how a hash covenant can let you do the exact next transaction covenant, and that's what check template verify does. This, on its own, enables a lot in Bitcoin. The ARC protocol that Barak has proposed can be enabled by CTV. You can do things like coin pools and channel factories. There's a lot you can do. Because CTV lets you restrict the exact next transaction, you can say the next transaction here has to be paying this bunch of people. You know, like we could have the next transaction have an output for every person in this room as a restriction, and then have an agreement case where if we all agree to change that distribution of coins, we can just skip the CTV portion and change to a new CTV with a single on-chain transaction. So all of us are in one UTXO. We've each got our balance within that UTXO. And as long as we all agree, we can shift balance between us with just doing a single one input, one output transaction on Bitcoin. So CTV alone lets you do pretty cool stuff in terms of sharing UTXOs. A little more context on the slide here. You can read it. Sighash anyprev out is another, was not intended to be a covenant opcode, or covenant change, to be clear. Sighash anyprev out, the history of this is that it was designed to enable the L2 or LN symmetry upgrade to Lightning. And that's another way to scale Bitcoin. Covenants scale Bitcoin, as I said. Sighash anyprev out, by enabling L2 or LN symmetry, lets Lightning node runners, lets more people run their own Lightning nodes. It reduces the complexity and the costs and the risks of running Lightning nodes because there's no longer a penalty situation where you can lose all your funds because there's not what's called toxic asymmetric data, which there is in the existing Lightning protocol. So that's what Sighash anyprev out enables. How does it do that? It creates 2 whole new key types in TapScript specifically, where the signatures for those types don't have to specify which inputs they're signing for. Normally in Bitcoin, all of our signatures to date have specified exactly which inputs they're spending, exactly which coins or which bills they're spending. With Sighash anyprev out, you can make a signature that allows any matching input to be spent. As long as it has a structurally similar script, it can be spent with the same signature. and that's what enables L2. This is somewhat similar when you use it as a covenant to op check template verify, because the check template verify hash hashes everything of the transaction except the inputs, and any prev out allows you to make signatures that cover everything except the inputs as well. But there are some differences. Because any prev out was built on top of the existing signature hashing structure in Bitcoin, which is kind of the history of it, it doesn't constrain the TX IDs of later transactions. That's getting awfully technical, and I'm sorry about that. The point of it is that certain protocols depend on predictable TX IDs, and check template verify provides that. Any prev out does not. Yeah, that's enough about that. Next one to talk about here is op unvault and vault recover, BIP 345, called the op vault BIP, because originally it was op vault, but now it's op unvault and op vault recover. These are awesome. They're interesting. They do both of these two more complex types of covenant, the deferred and the series of transactions. With op unvault, when you use an op unvault, it creates a delay and an intermediate transaction on the way to wherever you wanted to spend your Bitcoin. So you're like, I want to pay Alice 1,000,000 sats, and your vault says, first, you have to put it in this delay state for 2 hours. And then, assuming nothing else happens, the payment goes on to Alice via a check template verify. And then vault recover says, but with no authentication or very minor authentication, you can also send this to whatever your safest storage keys are. Maybe you've got like a pre-made 7 of 97 or whatever social recovery system set up with a mini script on that side, and you can send your funds in between when you try to send them, when they get to your recipient, you can send them to that safe place. So if someone gets your secret keys, but they don't get your 7 of 97 super secret keys, you can keep your Bitcoin safe. And you can watch, you can pay someone to watch even. You can use a watchtower like in Lightning to watch the blockchain for transaction spending. And if you don't respond to an email within that hour, they send your Bitcoin off to your super extra secret safe keys. So this is the reactive recovery that you can get. I'm a huge fan of OpVault. This is James O'Byrne working on this. It's kind of a big change in terms of the code that has to change in Bitcoin to do it, but I think it's really good. I have to speed up here. So TX hash is the everything hashed covenant. You want to have the flexibility to take any detail of your transaction and check whether that is what it should be with a covenant. TX hash lets you do that. It provides a bit filter to pick what parts of a transaction you hash. This is a pretty big change, but it also enables basically everything if you also do checksig from stack. So checksig from stack is a separate opcode that I'm not going to get into detail about, but with that, TX hash enables all of the covenant features pretty much. Now, I have my own proposal that I'm running some time to talk about, which is template key. In some ways, this is similar to the mashup of TX hash and any prev out. The same way that any prev out introduces new TapScript key types and new ways to hash to check those, so does my template key proposal. But then it also adds those same hashing modes to check template verify, so that you can use the same restrictions both with a signature and with a hash equality check. I think that's cool. Maybe other people do as well. That's mine. Now, the true almost everything covenant, opcat. This is something, again, the previous speaker set me up for this. He said that originally there were many more opcodes in Bitcoin script. This was one of them. It was removed by Satoshi because there was a denial of service stack vector with it. And this single little opcode, all it does is let you attach 2 bits of data in your Bitcoin script together, can, through a variety of tricks, including math and data provided from the input script, can emulate almost all of the other covenants that we've talked about. So I have a diagram of that. The only covenant that we talked about that opcat alone cannot emulate is op unvault, creating that series of transactions. We would need one more opcode on there, something like op tweak verify, in order to emulate op unvault. But opcat emulates everything else. And here's kind of the relationships where TX hash replaces or upgrades check template verify, template key upgrades check template verify, but replaces any prev out. So this is kind of my summary diagram here. And now I'm going to fly through my opinions. Bitcoin needs to change. We want Bitcoin to be for everybody. And if Bitcoin is going to be for everybody, we need to scale the kinds of people that can hold their own public key or private keys, meaning people being more comfortable, it being safer, et cetera. And we need to scale the sharing of UTXOs. And covenants let us do both of those things. So Bitcoin needs to change to scale with covenants. Opt check template verify, I kind of skimmed over it earlier, is a very small change to Bitcoin. It's been out there for a long time without being modified and proposed for inclusion 2 years ago, but was rejected for a variety of reasons. I think it belongs in Bitcoin. Safe cache any prev out is fine, but I find it uninspiring. I love op vault. I think it belongs in Bitcoin as well. TX hash, I don't know. It does a lot. It's hard to use, I think, but it might belong in Bitcoin. Same for my own proposal. And opcat might belong back in Bitcoin. It enables a lot of stuff, so we have to think about it pretty hard. My important takeaway here is I think opt check template verify does belong in Bitcoin. And we don't have time for questions, but you can find me there or around the conference to talk about this. All right.